Hello, everyone. Welcome to the semifinals match in the JCSA High Schools Debate Competition for 2025. My name is Jermaine Barrett, and I have the privilege of serving as the chair adjudicator for this match. I will now invite my colleague adjudicators to introduce themselves, beginning with Matthew White.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew White. I'll be the wing adjudicator or one of wing adjudicators this afternoon. I'm looking forward to a hearty, healthy match to follow the match we had just now, and may the best team win.
Thank you very much, Matthew White. Javon Downey, you are our second wing adjudicator. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, guys. The name is Ravon Doni, as was just said, and I am joining this match all the way from the United Kingdom. Yes. And I'm just looking forward to an exciting matchup and contestation of ideas, and best of luck to both teams.
Indeed, and if I may disclose a little secret, Javon is in the United Kingdom as a Chevening scholar, and we're enormously proud of him. Ladies and gentlemen, we have two teams gathered here to contest an exciting motion. Let us get to know those two teams. We have in onside proposition the team Immaculate Conception High School for Girls, or rather, they only have girls attending that school. And on the opposition team, we have Knox College. All right, so let us get to meet our debaters, beginning with the debaters on Team Immaculate, the proposition team. Immaculate, please unmute your microphones and introduce yourselves in the order in which you'll be speaking.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olivia Powell, and I will be the first propositional speaker for this house today.
Good afternoon. My name is Dejane Jonas, and I will be the second speaker for side proposition today.
Good afternoon. My name is Aisha Stone, and I will be the third speaker for side proposition today.
All right, thank you very much, Immaculate. Now over to Knox College, the opposition team. Please unmute your microphones and introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharian Smith, and I'll be the first speaker of the opposition.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jenny Scott, and I will be the second speaker for the opposition.
Good afternoon. My name is Summer Anderson, and I'll be the third speaker of opposition.
Thank you very much. Now, by now, the teams are acutely aware of the rules of this contest, but for you, our viewing audience, I'll do the honors of just going through them again. So we have on each team 3 debaters. This is called, by the way, the Jade Parliamentary debate format. On each team, we have 3 debaters. The first debater will speak for 3 minutes. Did I say 3 minutes? 7 minutes. The second debater speaks for 6 minutes, and the third and final debater will speak for 5 minutes. After the first 2 debaters, as first proposition of the Prime Minister and the first opposition, the leader of the opposition make their presentations, we will enter a period of cross-examination. We'll enter another period of cross-examination after the Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader of the opposition has had their say. Then we will pause for 1 minute, followed by the reply speeches, beginning with the opposition team first. Knox College, you get to go first, in delivering their reply speech, followed by the proposition's reply speaker's presentation. All right. Of course, debaters, and you are, please be reminded that your first and last minutes are protected. That's if it is that you're either the first or second speakers. So I'm going to ask Matthew White to double up as the timekeeper as well. So the first minute and last minutes of your speech are protected. Between those 2 minutes, or after the first minutes up to the last minute, you will have the opportunity to receive and answer points of information. In fact, we encourage you to accept and respond to at least 1 point of information. Of note, no point of information is allowed during the reply speeches. All right, I think my debaters are thoroughly furnished and ready to go. But before we get this debate started, we must hear our motion. So this time I'm going to invite Matthew White to do the honors to announce the motion.
The motion we are gathered here to debate today reads, This House regrets the growing medicalization of normal emotional struggles.
What emotion? Yes.
The growing medicalization of normal emotional struggles.
Okay, thank you. All right, so at this time, without any further delay, we call upon the Honorable Prime Minister who hails from Immaculate Conception High School. Madam Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Okay, can everyone hear me clearly and see me clearly?
In fact, we can.
Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Olivia Powell, and I'm the first speaker for the proposition, and we stand before you valiantly arguing for the motion. This House regrets the growing medicalization of normal emotional struggles. My second speaker, Dijane Jonas, will substantiate this claim, and our third speaker, Aisha Stone, will crystallize our argument and prove why the side proposition wins this debate. Mr. Speaker, let us be clear from the outset. This debate is not about denying mental illness. It is not about rejecting therapy, psychiatry, or care. We firmly believe that genuine mental illness deserves medical attention. But what we reject unequivocally is the dangerous expansion of medicine into spaces where it does not belong. Medicalization is not simply giving emotions a label, as opposition may claim. It is the process by which ordinary human experiences are framed as medical problems, diagnosed as disorders, and treated through clinical interventions. It is a threefold definition. It takes what is human and turns it into something pathological. And what are normal emotional struggles? Mr. Speaker, they are natural, proportional, temporary responses to life challenges. Stress before an exam, sadness after loss, anxiety in uncertainty. These emotions do not impair functioning, nor do they require clinical intervention. So when the opposition stands and argues that people need help understanding
Point of information.
not accepted at this time, they're debating a different motion, because this house is about normal emotional struggles. And if they cannot justify medicalizing normality, Mr. Speaker, the proposition wins this debate. Mr. Speaker, our case is simple. When normal human emotions are treated as medical problems, harm follows, both to individuals and to society. First, it reshapes the human experience itself. When every discomfort becomes a diagnosis, resilience,
Point of information.
not accepted at this time, begins to disappear. When every difficult emotion is treated as a defect, people start developing coping mechanisms. And when every struggle is handed over to medical authority, society becomes dependent on solutions that were never meant for ordinary life. We do not just mislabel emotions, we weaken people. Mr. Speaker, growing medicalization is happening not just in language, but in speech, diagnosis, and treatment, all proved by statistics. Antidepressant prescriptions have surged dramatically, with tens of millions issued annually in countries like England, despite no corresponding decrease in overall stress. Surveys show that 84% of general practitioners believe everyday stress and sadness are increasingly being mislabeled as mental illness. Mr. Speaker, 84% of general practitioners side with side proposition. Even leading psychiatrists warn us of this trend. As Alan Francis states, normality is an endangered species. Mr. Speaker, let us bring this home. We are a nation with limited mental health resources. Fewer than 200 psychiatrists serving our—
Bits of information.
Not accepted. Our healthcare is already under strain. So what happens when we begin treating normal emotional struggles as medical cases? We crowd out the system. People who do not need clinical care take up scarce resources, and those with severe mental illnesses wait longer, and the entire system stretches closer to the breaking point. This is not compassion, it is misallocation, and it is harmful. I'll take that point of information now.
Okay, so how is it that you mechanize or like provide a framework for what normal mental health looks like under your side?
Okay, thank you for that question. We are defending a framework that already exists. Psychiatrists have already defined what is normal. When we define normal emotional struggles, we talk about it impairs your daily functioning over time and then normal is that it is an experience that you would have to a specific event in your life. It is temporary. So when it reaches over into the threshold of being a clinical disease, that is when it becomes abnormal. That is when it becomes clinically necessary to be medicated. Moving on. Mr. Speaker, the proposition goes further. Growing medicalization does not merely mislabel illness, it manufactures it. Mr. Speaker, please follow me. Through labeling theory, once an individual is called mentally ill, the label does not just stay external, it becomes identity. Stress becomes disorder, sadness becomes pathology. This then spirals into a self-fulfilling prophecy. People begin to over-monitor themselves, reinterpret normal emotions as symptoms, and depend on treatment instead of building resilience. And finally, society locks this in through the sick rule, where individuals are no longer expected to cope, but to be treated where agency is replaced with dependency. Mr. Speaker, when you combine these forces, the outcome is clear and dangerous, and we do not simply treat illness, we create it under the opposition side. It is important to note we are not ignoring real mental illness. Those who may seem normal but are truly struggling under medical care are carefully identified and treated. What we are challenging is the dangerous trend of turning everyday sadness, stress, and grief into disorders. Over-medicalization blurs the line, or growing medicalization blurs the line between normal life and illness, creating unnecessary problems, unnecessary treatment, and unnecessary suffering. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. The proposition fully supports medicalization where it is needed. Real mental illness deserves real treatment, but that is not the question of this debate. The problem is when normal emotions such as stress, sadness, and grief that we all experience are treated as pathology. This is where harm begins. Mr. Speaker, there are better ways. In Jamaica, our family, friends, and churches provide natural support networks. Emotional struggles are shared, normalized, and guided, not medicalized. We can teach coping skills, mindfulness, journaling, exercise, time management, and build resilience programs in schools and communities. These tools allow people to manage everyday stress without being labeled ill. Mr. Speaker, medicalization saves lives when genuine illness is prevented. But for normal emotions, education, community, and resilience building are the solutions. We can help people thrive without creating illness where none exists. So, Mr. Speaker, I leave you with this. When we medicalize normal emotional struggles, we do not simply treat illness, we redefine humanity itself. Stress becomes a disorder, sadness becomes pathology, and ordinary life becomes something that must be medicated. A society that cannot distinguish between illness and humanity does not become healthier, it becomes dependent, fragile, and afraid of its own emotions. And
Thank you. Thank you very much, Speaker.
why
You are out of time. Thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation and for so spectacularly opening this debate. We now move to the opposition leader to hear their presentation. Let us make the opposition leader welcome. Hear, hear.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I'm hearing you.
Okay. Wait. 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, on the opposition bench, we believe medicalization represents progress in how societies understand and respond to mental health. It represents two critical developments. First, it legitimizes emotional suffering by recognizing that even normal psychological distress deserves to be addressed and alleviated. Second, it creates pathways through which individuals can receive professional evaluation and support to address issues to a degree that is proportional to severity. Now, this motion specifically refers to normal emotional struggles. Opposition therefore does not claim that every emotional struggle should immediately become a medical diagnosis or should be treated with a medical prescription. Instead, we posit that medicalization can change how those struggles are responded to. Our case contends that even normal distress is still distress, meaning it's still uncomfortable, still disorienting, and still mentally strenuous, especially if citizens lack appropriate coping mechanisms. In the government's world, individuals would be expected to endure privately until their distress becomes severe. But we believe this is inadequate. We will prove this by establishing that the opposition's world produces far better outcomes for individuals within the society. Now, Mr. Speaker, the word regret sets a very high burden for the government. To regret something, they must prove that the harms of medicalizing normal emotional struggles significantly outweighs its benefits, that the society would clearly be better off without this development. Opposition does not need to prove that medicalization is perfect. We only need to demonstrate two things. And the first one, allowing normal emotional struggles to be evaluated through medical frameworks creates important benefits. And also that the alternative world where those struggles remain labeled as normal and outside professional frameworks leave individuals significantly worse off. Mr. Speaker, medicalization may be defined as a process by which non-medical problems or everyday human experiences come to be understood and addressed within a medical framework, meaning they may be evaluated, assessed, or supported by trained health professionals, even if they do not ultimately result in formal diagnosis or treatment. It is imperative that we first provide an important distinction for the proposition. Medicalization does not mean everyone is diagnosed. It means there is a formal route towards trained professionals who are accountable for assessing and responding, where the care they provide is proportional to the issue and measured according to professionally established criterion, like the DSM-5, which has been developed by mental health professionals and legally restrictive to prevent overreach. Under proposition, this same distress remains normal, which means it sits outside the healthcare system. They may point to guidance counselors or informal support, but these are not a part of a standardized, enforceable system of care. Therefore, they are less reliable, less qualitative, and ill-suited for the status quo. Mr. Speaker, the Jamaican context makes proposition stance inadequate. Jamaica faces a severe mental health burden with extremely limited formal support. There are only about 40 psychiatrists serving a population of over 2.8 million, roughly one psychiatrist per 70,000 people. At the same time, studies and regional data consistently show high levels of untreated depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and interpersonal violence, all of which are linked to poor emotional regulation and maladaptive coping mechanisms. To simplify, even normal emotional distress is not appropriately treated. Importantly, Mr. Speaker, these institutional inadequacies are not a loss for opposition, because their instability stems primarily from a lack of focused investment. That transitions us to our first substantive point, Mr. Speaker. Medicalizing normal emotional struggles allow for increased medical health care access, and it addresses the main issues contributing to the stigmatization present in the status quo. We made this argument because in Jamaica, emotional distress is framed as a personal weakness or something to endure. This both discourages help seeking and defines who the system is built for. But this can be seen in three ways, where firstly, only extreme cases are recognized as real mental health issues. Secondly, healthcare systems are therefore designed almost entirely around crisis intervention. And thirdly, governments deprioritize funding because the affected group appears to be small. This is the status quo proposition is defending. However, medicalization changes this by redefining normal emotional stress as something that falls within the responsibility of healthcare systems, because governments can recognize that there is not accepted at this time, that there is the possibility for escalation. Individuals within the society are otherwise inclined to practice maladaptive coping mechanisms, and distress is not normalized just because the scale of it is minor in comparison to larger neurological issues. This has two outcomes, Mr. Speaker. The first one is that it increases the amount governments are willing to spend. In the government's world, where normal emotional struggles are not medicalized, mental health appears to only affect a small group of people with severe conditions. As a result, the issue is treated as niche. Systems are designed for crisis cases only, and governments have weak incentives to invest heavily because the affected population appears to be limited. With that, spending large amounts of resources on a problem that only seems to affect a minority is politically difficult to justify. However, medicalization changes this incentive structure. Once normal emotional structures are recognized within a medical framework, mental health is no longer a niche issue. It has become a large-scale population concern. That creates two strong incentives for government. First, the scale of the problem becomes impossible to ignore. When a large portion of the population is affected, untreated distress begins to impact things like productivity levels. Secondly, the scale makes investment politically and economically justifiable because governments are now responding to a widespread public health care issue. In the government world, stigma persists because mental health care is associated only with extreme cases. If only severe conditions are recognized, then seeking help sends a strong signal that something is seriously wrong with you. That has two consequences, Mr. Speaker. First, the individuals experiencing normal distress avoid seeking help. And secondly, even community support systems are underused because people do not feel justified turning to them. So, Mr. Speaker, in the propositions world, distress is labeled as normal, which as a result causes help seeking to feel unnecessary or shameful. Individuals then withdraw or suppress, and both formal and informal support goes unused. However, medicalization changes this by expanding who mental health systems are for. When normal emotional struggles are included, a much wider group of people are recognized as legitimate users of support. Help seeking is no longer reserved for
Thank you,
extreme cases.
Speaker.
And social.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leader of the Opposition there from Knox College. Ladies and gentlemen, we now move to the first segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the opposition team, Team Knox, gets to ask 3 questions, first of Team Proposition, Team Immaculate Conception High School. Now, each of those questions is limited to 10 seconds, each response limited to 45 seconds. Afterwards, we'll allow Immaculate to ask their 3 questions of Knox, and so we'll end the first segment of cross-examination. All right. So, Knox, you may now proceed to ask your 3 questions of Immaculate.
Okay, so if you regret medicalization, then what practical systems replaces it when someone's emotional struggle begins to seriously affect their ability to work or function? Because we've already justified to you that informal systems are not adequate given the circumstances.
Sorry to stop you, but I couldn't hear anything at the start of your question. Can you please re-say
Okay, wait, can you hear me clearly right now?
I can hear you clearly now.
Okay, so our question is, if you regret medicalization, then what practical systems do you have to replace it when someone is struggling emotionally? Because we've proven that informal systems are not adequate given stigmatization that exists uniquely under Prop's world.
Okay, in Jamaica, we have a culture where familial support, support through religion and connections is what is primarily accepted. And this is something that does work for many people, right? And we also have therapy. Persons can seek therapy. Even though it would be considered formal, it is not medicalization. Talking to someone about your issues and deciphering them with someone is something that falls outside of the scope or can fall outside of the scope of medicalization that people can use. So do not mistake that medicalization is the only way that medical or mental health issues or emotions can be validated and regulated. We have many more, a plethora more of things that can be used to regulate your emotions and to understand them.
Additionally, medicalization is not the solving or the solution of stigma, as you presented that stigma exists on our side uniquely, but rather the solution to that is awareness and education.
Right. Over-medicalization does not solve stigma and stigma of mental health issues.
Okay, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, then if the system only intervenes when the stress becomes like evident and severe, then aren't you guaranteeing that people will only receive help when treatment becomes harder and more expensive?
Okay, thank you for that question. So in psychiatry, as we said before it becomes that level, before it reaches the threshold of clinical diagnosis, there are other treatments that the person can take. So when it becomes or it goes beyond the threshold of clinical diagnosis, that is when medicalization is needed. So it's not just a labeling, it's also prescription, right?
Under our model, we present other avenues by which people can resolve their emotional distress before it becomes an issue. So what you guys are saying is that we didn't present any ways by which their emotional issues can be resolved when we did. So, yeah.
Right. So we have to understand that medicalization is not the only way to validate, is not the only way to solve, and it's not the only way to address normal emotional issues. And let me be clear, this motion says normal emotions, not clinical disorders, not emotions that impair your everyday functioning, right? So these are more accurately or can be solved by informal ways of quelling your emotional state.
Okay, so we want you to tell us specifically what these early interventions are and why it is that they're going to be more effective than medicalization under our world.
Okay, so early interventions. So early interventions can simply, as we mentioned before, can simply be talking to your friend, can simply be explaining your mental state to them, having a back and forth. And you can go to therapy. Therapy is with a trained professional, and this is not medicalization. This is something available to many persons. And even in school, you have guidance counselors that you can go to, that you can talk to.
And why is this better than medicalization? That was also a part of your question. Medicalization includes diagnosing and also prescribing medication to treat a certain illness. If a person is not experiencing a lot of the symptoms of the medical illness, but they're taking the medication, they will experience the side effects without getting the treatment from the medication. So that leads to negative impacts on them, as well as the labeling theory that Olivia mentioned in her speech. When a person is diagnosed, they tend to take on a sick role, and they tend to believe that their identity revolves around this diagnosis. Okay. So that's why medicalization is not.
Apparently Jermaine fell off. He should be joining us back shortly, so we're just gonna give him a minute or so to rejoin.
Am I being heard and seen? Hello.
Yes, Jermaine, I'm both hearing and seeing you.
Oh, thank you very much. And am I in the right position?
Indeed, you are.
All right. I am sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. I've just had a little glitch with my device, but I heard the third question and answer from the opposition team, Team Knox, and I'm not sure if we've proceeded beyond that. Have we, Matthew?
Yes, it's now time for Immaculate questions to Knox.
Okay, all right. So we haven't proceeded beyond that. All right. So Immaculate, you may now pose your three questions to Knox.
Great, thank you so much.
How do you contend, you cite DSM, this system, to substantiate your argument, but how do you contend with Alan Francis, the man who made this system, denouncing the system and saying that it is harmful? How are you defending a system that the creators of that system said that it is harming people by over-pathologizing normal human emotion?
First of all, sorry, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so in our response to this, we're going to tell you directly that the DSM-5, whether or not it has been discredited, it has since moved away from its original creator, and it is now in the hands of the local psychological field. So that means it is for them to edit, it is for them to research, it is for them to adjust. It is used within college frameworks, and it is a research framework, as in to say that it is not sourced only from one individual person at this current period of time. There has been additions made thereafter. And in the first place, our main argument here is simply that we introduce a framework or a criteria by which individuals are being judged. So we're not giving them medications, we're not giving them medication as a form of diagnosis. We're using a specific criteria that other individuals who are professionals in the field have conceded to or have legitimized. And we're saying that we ensure that individuals are not being overdiagnosed and they're not being prescribed with medications where they could simply be prescribed with precautions or with activities to alleviate their discomfort or accommodations that they can instate on their own time. So additionally, what we're seeing under yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So we now proceed to the second question from Immaculate.
Okay. At what point does normal stress and normal emotion become a medical disorder? Can you give this house a clear threshold?
Okay, so in response to that, we're telling you that this is something you have to contend with because this is only ever obvious in hindsight. So in the status quo, we see that individuals do not have the frameworks to recognize this themselves even. We're going to elucidate on that further. But the case is such that individuals need intervention from early in order to prevent this transition because they're not likely to be able to recognize when they cross the threshold between being fatigued and being burned out. They're not likely to be able to identify themselves because they do not have the professional perspective of this. And what we do as the opposition is that we understand that this framework is provided under our side because we utilize the government and the state to disseminate these specific resources so it is accessible to individuals who otherwise do not have the specialty. They do not have the practice or the prestige. And this allows for these individuals to receive intervention before escalation occurs. You have to contend with escalation. That's your point and your harm.
Okay. So how do you contend with the fact that awareness, education, and access can quell issues that deal with early intervention? That over-medicalization or growing medicalization does not need to occur to assess these.
The thing is, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so the thing is, we have what you have to a greater scale. That was our argument. We allow for individuals to receive a more normalized approach because under your side, still because the perspective or the presentation of mental illness is reserved exclusively for the harshest, the most extreme of examples. Individuals with schizophrenia screaming on the roadside. That is what these mental health frameworks primarily address. Because otherwise, that's what individuals associate mental health with. Because that's also the only way that interventionist policies from the government apply when it comes to mental health care infrastructure. On the our side, however, we say that we allow for normalization. You might also allow for normalization, but not to the degree that we do. Because we have a greater mechanization for destigmatization. Because individuals believe that mental illness is a normal thing that can plague anyone in any degree to any severity, and therefore it is not something isolated to the most extreme of circumstances. This destigmatizes it, it reduces the social costs, and it encourages individuals, more so on our side than on yours, to seek interventional policies at the earlier stages, unlike under your work.
Any degree, any severity can get medical. Sorry.
Immaculate. Thank you. You're muted, Jermaine.
Sorry, was that the third question from Immaculate?
Yes, it was.
All right, thank you very much, Matthew. All right, so with that, ladies and gentlemen, we continue our debate. Let us now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister from Team Immaculate to advance the proposition's case. Hear, hear.
Good afternoon. Are you able to hear me and see me clearly?
Yes, we are.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I am Dejanay Jonas, second speaker for the proposition. Let me begin by clarifying the strategic terrain of this debate. Mr. Speaker, we expect the opposition to continue to do one of three things. Either redefine medicalization so softly that it simply needs support, blur the line between normal emotional struggle and illness, or argue that because some normal struggles are serious, they must be medically managed. But all three fail. Support is not the same as medicalization, seriousness is not the same as sickness, and the blurred boundary is not a justification for erasing it. Mr. Speaker, the opposition claims that medicalization increases access to resources. In doing so, they confuse visibility with pathology. We do not need to pathologize people to prioritize them. Mr. Speaker, increased resources come from credit, advocacy, and policy prioritization, not from labeling normal human emotion as illness. In fact, medicalization does the opposite. It floods the system with unnecessary demand and undermines the very care they claim to expand. We do not need to create more patients to justify better care. We need to fix the system itself. More importantly, if reducing stigma under their model means medicalizing ordinary human reactions, then the opposition is not reducing stigma. They're redefining humanity as pathology. Additionally, the opposition questioned our definition of normal emotional struggles, but it is not arbitrary. The distinction provided by our first speaker is one that has been standardized and accepted by psychologists all around the world. Let us now turn to the harms of this trend and why the opposition's model is flawed at every level. My first claim, medicalization harms individuals by reframing normal emotion as illness, leading to misdiagnosis and unnecessary intervention. Mr. Speaker, the problem is not just medication. Once distress is framed medically, individuals begin to interpret normal emotional experiences through illness. Modern healthcare operates under a predictable structure. It starts with diagnosis, followed by prescription, which is then followed by treatment. Once a label is applied, intervention becomes the default response. Research shows that approximately 26% of patients diagnosed with depression in primary care do not meet clinical criteria, meaning more than 1 in 4 people are being unnecessarily labeled. And medicalization does not need a pill bustle to be harmful. A label alone is able to reshape identity. The impact of this is clear. Individuals face unnecessary side effects and dependency and increased exposure to prescription misuse. People begin to rely on medical solutions for emotions they should be able to understand and process, but most importantly, resources are misallocated. In Jamaica, just 100 mental health facilities serve over 3 million people. When normal emotional struggles enter clinical systems, clinics are overcrowded and those with severe illnesses are pushed further back. Mr. Speaker, the opposition claims medicalization improves access. We show the truth. It actually increases demand faster than it can increase capacity. And crucially, the opposition confuses seriousness with medicalness. A struggle can be painful, disruptive, even overwhelming, and still not require a medical framework. My second claim, medicalization is driven not only by care, but by economic incentives. More diagnoses relate to more prescriptions, boosting pharmaceutical markets. The global antidepressant market exceeds $15 billion annually.
Pharmaceutical companies benefit directly when more people are classified as patients. This is reinforced through the expanding of diagnostic categories, which widen the boundary of what counts as illness. The opposition presents medicalization as benevolent, but the reality is that normal human experiences, grief, stress, and disappointment under their model will become market opportunities. This is not just healthcare, it will become the commercialization of human emotion. The opposition likes to call this support, but we call it what it actually is: profit-driven pathologization. My third and final claim, Mr. Speaker: medicalization shifts responsibility from systems onto individuals.
Point of
Many
information.
emotional not accepted. Many emotional struggles arise from external conditions such as poverty, inequality, academic pressure, and exploitative environments. But medicalization changes the question from what caused this to what disorder does this individual person have? Impact is abundantly clear. Stress caused by poverty becomes anxiety disorder. Burnout caused by overwork becomes depression. And institutions continue to escape accountability. Mr. Speaker, the question in this debate is not whether these struggles deserve support. We agree they do. The question is who should respond initially. The opposition hands ordinary human suffering to medical authority. We keep it within social, community, and institutional solutions first, where it belongs. They have no limiting principle, and that is how normal life becomes clinical territory. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, this debate is not about denying care for mental illness. It's about protecting the boundary between human experience and medical disorder. When normal emotional struggles are medicalized, emotions become diagnoses, diagnoses become prescriptions, prescriptions become profit, and social problems become personal pathology. The opposition's entire case rests on one flawed assumption, that the only way to take suffering seriously is to medicalize it. But we reject that, because this debate is about who gets authority over ordinary human experience. Opposition gives that authority to medical systems. We return it to people, communities, and society. And when medicine becomes the default lens for normal life, we do not just treat illness, we redefine what it means to be human, and we do so incorrectly. For those reasons, Mr. Speaker, this House must unapologetically regret the growing medicalization of normal emotional struggles as we temporarily rest our case. Thank you.
We thank you very much. That was the Deputy Prime Minister hailing from Immaculate Conception High School. We now move over to the opposition team to hear from their Deputy Speaker. Of course, the opposition team is Knox College. So at this time, let us welcome the Deputy Opposition Leader. Here.
Hello, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I'm able to hear you.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the term medicalization on the side of the government. Let us be clear, medicalization does not equate to medication. Mr. Speaker, as the opposition, we have already shown that medicalization increases institutional support and reduces stigmatization in the status quo. In traditional healthcare services, you are not automatically prescribed with medication. Secondly, I will further establish why the government's model fails in the Jamaican context, where individuals and institutions do not have the capacity to cope effectively. Finally, I will show why medicalization is necessary for improving outcomes over time, particularly for the most vulnerable. Let us remind this House of the premise of this debate. Again, we are discussing whether medicalizing normal emotional struggles leaves individuals worse off in the status quo. This requires a denigration of the counterfactual on the government side and the inverse on ours. The government's case assumes that if emotional struggles remain normal, individuals will cope effectively through informal systems like family, community, and religion. That assumption is not validated by our reality. Their model only works if individuals already have the internal skills to cope, and institutions reinforce healthy coping mechanisms. But in many rural and low-income communities, people grow up in conditions of generational poverty where emotional regulation is not formally taught, because immediate survival has to be prioritized over self-actualization. Individuals, therefore, are not equipped with structured coping mechanisms naturally. Rather, they are told man act like man, or adjust so like sit. At the same time, the very institutions the government might rely on as a replacement for medicalized systems reinforce these issues. Families and communities in these areas often normalize suffering and distress because it was so frequent and pervasive that they subconsciously and unintentionally romanticize their hardships to cope. So these alternative systems are uniquely unreliable in low-income communities because they are founded on the understandings and beliefs of the local population, which might not themselves have the best understanding of mental wellness. So this directly proves that low-resourced groups are underrepresented in the government's world. They are most likely to have maladaptive coping mechanisms. Their cultural institutions do not pose as adequate alternatives, and some form of intervention becomes necessary for these circumstances to change. Mr. Speaker, in our first speech, we clearly established the government's unique ability to provide higher quality and quantity of healthcare services on our side. This becomes relevant here. Medicalization begins with professionals developing frameworks that are then integrated into everyday systems like schools, clinics, or workplaces. This means people encounter mental health support in normal settings. As more people engage, distress becomes visible as a widespread issue, which gives governments a clear incentive to scale and fund these systems, especially in rural areas where it is most pervasive. Immediately on our side has increased accessibility to mental health care services in fraught areas, and we would have already proven why these citizens would care to interact with these provisions. Firstly, because their distress is reframed and legitimized by the wider society. Individuals no longer interpret what they are feeling as something they must endure because schools, workplaces, and media are using inclusive, normalizing language that acknowledges that even stress might need intervention. They recognize it as something they are allowed to address. Second, it lowers the cost of the social cost of seeking help. When a wider population engages with mental health systems, seeking support is no longer associated with extreme dysfunction or insanity. It becomes normal behavior. Third, it reduces the effort required to access support. Because services are integrated into everyday institutions, individuals do not need to actively seek out specialized care. They encounter it in environments they already trust. Fourth, individuals do want to feel better. We do not buy a case where these individuals refuse systems that are being offered to them at a low social or economic cost indefinitely, especially when these systems will become increasingly familiar as time passes, with their efficacy or convenience being proven. Now, Mr. Speaker, the opposition firmly asserts that medicalization is also necessary because it enables early intervention, which is the single most effective way to prevent emotional distress from escalating into severe long-term harm. Let us be very clear about the mechanism. Emotional struggles do not begin as crises. They begin as low-level distress, stress, sadness, anxiety, and frustration. But these are not static experiences. In the absence of structured intervention, individuals are forced to cope on their own, and what they default to is not what is effective, but what is available and immediately relieving. So they suppress emotions, avoid problems, externalize through aggression, or rely on substances. These responses do not resolve this stress. They stabilize it temporarily while allowing the underlying issue to deepen. So over time, what happens is predictable. Mild distress becomes chronic, and chronic distress becomes severe dysfunction. Now, Mr. Speaker, here is where the comparative matters. In the government's world, these early stage struggles are labeled normal, which means they are not recognized as requiring intervention. They are not tracked by institutions, and they are not responded to by any structured system. So intervention only occurs after escalation, when the individual is already in crisis. At that point, behaviors are entrenched, distress is more complex, and treatment is more resource intensive and less effective. Their model is therefore reactive. It does not prevent harm, it waits for it. Medicalization does one critical thing, Mr. Speaker. It legitimizes early stage distress as something that can be addressed. That creates three structural changes. First, individuals are more likely to recognize when something is wrong and seek help earlier. Two, institutions like schools, clinics, and workplaces become entry points for low-level intervention. And third, professionals can assess and respond proportionately before escalation occurs. So instead of waiting for a crisis, our system intervenes when habits are still flexible, individuals are still functional, and solutions are still simple. This means mild distress is resolved early instead of being allowed to compound, because their entire model depends on keeping these struggles normal. The moment you label something as normal, you remove urgency, you remove institutional responsibility, and you remove the justification for early intervention. They might claim that families or communities will intervene early, but that fails for two
All right, thank
reasons.
you. Thank
First,
you very much, Speaker. I'm sorry you're out of time. All right, thank you very much for that spirited presentation. That was the Deputy Leader of the Opposition from Knox College. Ladies and gentlemen, we now enter the second segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the rules as obtained in the first instance also applies, except well, of course, it applies entirely, I apologize. So we now go to the opposition team, that's Knox College, to hear your three questions posed to Immaculate, the proposition team.
Okay, so in a society like ours where people are told to suck it up, then how does labeling struggles as normal and like encouraging people to turn to familiar structures alleviate discomfort or distress if these systems are ineffective or propagating the kind of distress or like poor coping mechanisms? Can you hear us?
If you want to claim that these systems, these informal systems, as well as therapy that we are propagating are ineffective, if that is so, fix the system. Do not elevate the standard to medicalization. We've already proven that medicalization on its own also carries its own set of risks, right? So if this is the issue, then all we have to do is fix the current system that exists in terms of awareness and education, giving people the resources and the tools that they need to address these issues within their community-based scope, rather than elevating to a system that will produce more damages and more harm.
Okay, in your second speaker speech, you consistently cite understanding as an issue, that people do not understand the emotions or the struggles that they are going through. This is directly quoted. If understanding is the issue, then medicalization and growing medicalization is not the solution. Awareness and education is. The government has
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you.
Knox College, you may ask your second question.
Do you accept that medicalization includes therapy and counseling and it's not just medication? And if so, why should we regret people being able to access professional support? You would have yourself made an argument for therapy, which is better realized or better facilitated by medicalization.
Okay. The proposition has consistently misunderstood medicalization. Opposition has consistently misunderstood medicalization. When we talk about medicalization, the motion talks about it in a general sense. Medicalization talks about the medical language, the clinical diagnosis, and medication. And as we see by statistics, we have that the medicine is being prescribed, prescriptions are being given, right? And the second part of your question that you asked, so we do Therapy can be medicalization. It can be, but it does not always have to be, right? Talking to your guidance counselor is a form of therapy. Going to a therapist, an independent private therapist or an independent pro bono therapist is a form of releasing or coping with your issues. And if these are right, and there are also hotlines. Jamaica has a mental health hotline that you can call into and get help. There are resources. The issue is that these resources are not educated to the people, are not given to the people, and the people are not aware of them. If these do not become enough, then the scope of your emotional stability becomes abnormal and it becomes debilitating. Then you need medication. Then you need medicalization. Then you need to go to a clinical diagnosis, because there is a stark difference, or there is a
Thank you, Speaker.
between normal and abnormal.
All right. I believe we're now at the third question from Knox. Knox, you may proceed with your final question.
Okay, our last question for you is, can you clearly define, would you rather risk over-treating someone who might not need it or under-treating someone who could end up with a serious mental health crisis, likely even committing suicide?
Actually, under your model, it is more likely that that person won't get the help that they need. In Jamaica, we're talking about our country. We have 200 psychiatrists that serve 3 million people. The issue is not that we need to growingly medicalize these issues. The issue is that we need to have awareness and we need to have access, right? Under your system, everyone will now think, if you now talk about normal emotional struggles as if they're not a part of just human life, but they are medical issues that need the medical intervention, then we will overcrowd our system. It is just the reality that Jamaica does not have the capacity to do this. And because of that, persons who you say want to commit suicide or have these ideations will be delayed in receiving the care that they need, because the system that they would have used is overcrowded by unnecessary medical interventions that do not need to happen.
Thank you again, Speaker.
Thank you very much, Knox College, for those questions. Thanks to Immaculate for those responses. Immaculate, you may now proceed to ask your three questions of Knox.
If government incentives, if government incentivizes diagnosis, what prevents doctors from overdiagnosing to meet targets or secure funding? Doctors and the system they work in are not exempt from corruption.
This is true. However, what we would have stated multiple times within our speeches is that there are diagnostic criteria, and individuals are going to there are diagnostic criteria that are very clearly defined within the status quo. The issue has always been that they have not been applied to full breadth because Jamaica has a limited infrastructural capacity to encourage to apply mental health care needs. This isn't a loss for our side, by the way. But either way, the point is simply that you will not have doctors being able to supremely overreach in every instance. This would at best be a minority issue because they are supposed to use prescribed or outline methodologies that they themselves are subject to by practice. And there are legal frameworks that then rebut.
Okay. You consistently say diagnosis criteria. This diagnosis criteria that doctors have starkly differentiates between normal and clinical diagnosis. So if doctors themselves subscribe to this criteria, then why are we expanding the scope into normal emotionals that can be quelled by—
Thank you for asking that. We have been telling you repeatedly that the way that medicalization works is not by providing prescription. Rather, it's a case where individuals are checking to ensure that intervention stops them from escalating their own individual mental health care issues. What this diagnostic criteria does, it outlines the individual symptoms, and if these doctors are then able to highlight the risk within an individual's life, they're able to then find out how it is that an individual can reduce their chances of being afflicted with a long-term mental health issue. So it's just like going to a doctor for a physical checkup. You might not have the flu, but you might have a cold. You might not have the flu, but you might be sneezing. Either way, there is still something wrong with you that has not yet escalated, and a doctor is still capable of treating that because they know the symptoms and they know where the symptoms are able to be applied. So criteria are still relevant and they're still helpful and they still prevent overreach majorly. On your side, however, we see that individuals don't even have the capacity to access this care to the same extent that we do.
Okay. So you said that when something is wrong with someone, they don't have the capacity to understand this. But can that not be quelled with awareness and education other than over medicalization or medicalization in itself?
The thing is, what happens is medicalization allows for this exact understanding to be disseminated more effectively than on your side. Because the way that medicalization works, we told you outright, it's a case where doctors communicate with frameworks so that there's policies that are implemented. You're going to see this conversation happening in schools, in your workplace. You're going to see it being across the society. It will not be regulated to a doctor's office. It will be implemented throughout the society. So it's very accessible. It's used in communication and language. And the benefit of this is that people are being educated by exposure. Overall, not only are they being educated by exposure, that's also reducing stigma uniquely. We have larger scale reductions of stigma underneath our side. And because we have greater exposure, we also have greater incentive for these individuals to be able to access mental health care, even if—
Thank you very much. All right. So with that, we've come to the end of the second segment of cross-examination. We will now take a 1-minute pause, and then at the end of the pause, we'll resume with the reply speaker, the third speaker from Knox College. The debate will thereafter conclude with the third speaker's presentation from Immaculate Conception High School. Your 1-minute pause begins now. All right, ladies, we have come to the end of the 1 minute pause, and so it's now time for us to resume our debate. At this time, I call upon the third speaker, the reply speaker from Team Knox College, to conclude the opposition's case. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I'm able to hear you.
Okay, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. So, Mr. Speaker, 3 things in this speech. First, a framing of this debate, a weighing of the clashes, and an explanation of why we win even under Prop's best case. So, proposition contended that further extension of resources was undesirable because of inefficiencies and resource allocation issues. Their specific arguments was normal emotions being treated as an illness leads to mislabeling, that we have strained infrastructure resources that makes it unfeasible, that we have labeling theory, and overall, Mr. Speaker, very few of these were adequately mechanized on to such a degree that we would concede that the microcosmic state in which they present these issues outweigh the macro impacts on our side. Mr. Speaker, opposition made 3 main arguments. We said that we have better funded mental health care. We said that there's better likelihood of individuals seeking mental health care services on our side, even if proposition does posit mental health care services. We also said that we have better interventionist policies that overall improve the standard of mental welfare in the country. Not to enunciate on this, Mr. Speaker, we said that we have 3 ways in which mental health care is better funded: through visibility, resource expansion, and provision of intervention. The proposition would have made an argument that we misunderstood how it is that resources would be allocated. But visibility is the metric by which policies by governments are enacted. Governments do not otherwise have the capacity to determine what in the society is an issue worth focus unless there is visibility. Visibility, therefore, is a marker for the government to be able to identify that this is an issue of focus and that issue requires funding in order to alleviate. We said that this leads to resource expansion on our side, because if you have if you have medicalized care being normalized or being presented for normal mental health care issues, then we see that normal mental health care issues are being normalized throughout the society. This therefore increasing the breadth of individuals who mental health services would be applicable to. So the government no longer has the excuse of using fringe cases to justify the underfunded nature of infrastructure. Infrastructure being one of their main arguments. Therefore, we directly go off this. So resource expansion is then improved on our side because the government now has a way of identifying that there is an issue in the society because more people need mental health care services. There is a mental health care industry that is unable to satisfy these needs, and therefore funding must be allocated. This therefore improves the quality and quantity of mental health care services. And we told you that there were 2 reasons why this was important. Primarily because the individuals that proposition themselves are spotlighted as people who are the primary focus of mental health care would also receive better quality services. These individuals, being the people who have schizophrenia or high needs mental illnesses, get better provisions in the long term. In addition to individuals within the society getting access to interventionist policies that decrease the likelihood of their own individual issues escalating into debilitating mental health care issues. So the stakeholders in this, Mr. Speaker, are better alleviated or better allocated for on our side. That means people who do not have access to the alternative systems posited by the government, people who do not have access to family health services, or individuals who do not need individuals who do not have large-scale mental health issues but do not have the internal means of mitigating it for it or to prevent an escalation. Now, Mr. Speaker, a clarification of the model. The government would have claimed that medicalization is followed by medication, but this is fundamentally inaccurate because even in traditional healthcare services, you are not automatically prescribed with medication. You might be prescribed with a walk in the park. You might be prescribed with a stay in your bed. Overall, there is no guarantee that even in the most traditional lukewarm system that an individual has to receive pills to alleviate their issues. So this therefore is a direct cut to their argument. Now back to what we were saying, Mr. Speaker. We said that there's better likelihood of individuals seeking mental health care under our system. That therefore means that any argument that proposition presents, this is only something that they can ever be credited with if these individuals even seek to use their systems, which we tell you they currently are not likely to do. So we have a unique reduction of stigma under our world. Stigma is caused by the fact that the presentation of mental health illness in the Jamaican society is isolated isolated to the most fringe extreme cases. Therefore, individuals associate mental health and mental health care services with madness, instability, and great mental harm. And there's a great social harm in communicating or utilizing these services. That is something proposition primarily has to contend with. So, Mr. Speaker, because we have this reduction of stigma, because mental health care is normalized, because your stress and your depression, your stress or your despair or your anxiety, even if it is in a smaller or like a smaller degree to like schizophrenia or like long-term mental health issues, this is still something that the system is capable of allocating for. And because you're now included in the system and the system is so accessible and individuals are likely to communicate and interact with it over a long period of time, if only because of familiarity and the comfort it provides in accommodations, this means that we have more people willing to engage with mental health care in the long term on our side. This is something proposition simply does not have. Additionally, medicalization allows for increased understanding. Proposition has a fundamental misunderstanding here. The way that medicalization works is it's disseminated throughout the society. This therefore gives everyone access to it in their daily lives. You go to work, you hear that you are able to apply for leave because you have been working a long period of time, and mental health safeguards encourage you to interfere before this becomes detrimental for your long-term health. Mr. Speaker, this therefore means that individuals do not need to go to school in order to learn about mental health. It will be throughout the society, in posters, in media, in the way people communicate, because that's how medicalization works. It's a structural reform.
Thank you,
And this means
Speaker.
that it is the means of ensuring that education is disseminated. Therefore,
Thank you very much.
cooperative
Thank you very much for that speech. That was the third speaker from Team Opposition, Knox College. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now bring the curtains down on this debate with the presentation from the third speaker from the Proposition team, Immaculate Conception High School. Let's meet that speaker. Welcome. Hear, hear.
Are you able to hear me clearly?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
I will begin in 3, 2, 1. All protocols observed. I will begin by briefly summarizing our case before moving on to rebut the opposition. My first speaker established that this debate is not about denying mental illness, but about the growing expansion of a medical framework onto normal human emotions. She showed that when stress, sadness, and grief are treated as disorders, we pathologize normality, weaken resilience, and misallocate limited resources, especially in contexts like Jamaica. My second speaker then proved why the opposition's model fails. She showed that support does not require diagnosis and that medicalization leads to overdiagnosis, overmedication, and dependency. She also demonstrated that this trend is driven not just by care, but by commercial incentives, and that it shifts focus away from real social causes onto individuals. With that, I will now move to why the opposition's case cannot stand. Mr. Speaker, in psychology, normal behavior refers to emotional responses that are proportional, temporary, and do not significantly impair a person's ability to function. In contrast, abnormal behavior is typically defined by the 4 Ds: deviance, distress, dysfunction, and danger, meaning that the experience is persistent, excessive, and interferes with daily life. Mr. Speaker, the opposition's argument assumes that the only way to gain attention and funding is by expanding who counts as ill. And that is a dangerous trade-off, because what they are doing is inflating the category of mental illness in order to make it politically visible. But when everything is labeled as a mental illness, systems lose the ability to distinguish severity and prioritize effectively. Funding may increase in theory, but in practice it becomes diluted across a much larger group, leaving those with severe conditions still underserved. And more importantly, you do not need to medicalize normal emotional struggles to justify investment in mental health. That is a failure of policy, not a justification for pathologizing people. So their model does not strengthen the system. It expands it in a way that makes it less precise, less targeted, and ultimately less effective. They're saying that when we label emotional struggles as normal, this makes victims less likely to seek help. Mr. Speaker, the opposition again presents a false binary between normality and support. They suggest that if we recognize emotional struggles labeling. This is simply untrue. Individuals can seek counseling, community support, and guidance without being classified as ill. In fact, medicalizing normal emotions can discourage help seeking by making individuals feel broken or fear being labeled. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the opposition's argument rests on two flawed assumptions. First, that community and non-medical support are empirically ineffective, and second, that the only alternative to medicalization is silence or drug abuse. Both are simply untrue. The failure they describe is not a failure of non-medical support. It is a failure of access, quality, and social stigma, which exists regardless of whether we label normal emotions as illness. Medicalizing these emotions does not fix shame. It often reinforces it by attaching clinical labels that people may fear even more. And more importantly, replacing social and community-based responses with medical ones create dependency without addressing root causes. Mr. Speaker, furthermore, we noticed that when we asked the opposition to define the threshold between normal and emotional struggle and clinical illness, the opposition could not provide one. Instead, they retreat to a vague claim about helping people before they reach said threshold. But without a clear boundary, their model has no limiting principle. It allows medicalization to expand indefinitely because at any point, any emotion can be framed as approaching illness. This is not prevention, this is overreach. And more importantly, their argument assumes that individuals are incapable of recognizing and navigating normal emotional experiences without medical intervention, which strips people of agency and creates dependency. We support early support, but support does not require medicalization. Their model collapses the distinction entirely, and once that line is gone, everything becomes a case for treatment. If they cannot tell you where the line is, they cannot justify why it is to be crossed. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the opposition is attacking a position that we never made. Our argument is not that medicalization always leads to medication. It is that medicalization fundamentally changes how people understand themselves through labeling.
Okay, thank you very much, Speaker. You are out of time. Thank you. Thank you very much. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings our debate to a conclusion. We, as the judges, we have quite a lot to go and digest. So we will take our leave now to deliberate. And after we deliberate and are satisfied that we've arrived at a decisive call, we will return with that result as well as some analysis. All right. So for now, stay tuned. We'll be back with you shortly.
Hey, Jermaine, is there a breakout room for us to enter? You're muted.
All right, Javon, we will call you back. We'll call you, Javon. Hello, is everyone here? Am I being heard?
Yes, you're being
Am I
heard.
also being seen? Yes, no?
Yes, you are being seen.
Okay, all right. Whoa, let me first of all apologize for keeping you waiting anxiously so long. I think that this was a match, in a class all by itself. Brilliant argumentation. And I just want to commend both teams on a fantastic job. Of course, one team will advance all the way to the grand finals to face off against Cornwall College, and the second place team will participate in the third place playoff against Wolmer's Boys School rather. The scores are impressive. 200 and let me just recall. So 200. So one team ends with 278 to 287. So 278 to 287. A significant margin, we feel. Let's wade through the debate. Let's remind ourselves of the debate. So the debate was about regretting the growing trend where there is medicalization of, of normal sort of emotional issues or challenges. And of course, that's a paraphrasing of it. Let's remind ourselves also what we get from Team Proposition Immaculate. Immaculate tells us that once we medicalize emotional issues, we ultimately come to a state where there's going to be inescapably an over administration of drugs, of medication, which is sometimes inappropriate and leads to deleterious consequences. In fact, they say to us that it oftentimes escalates the issues to the point where it becomes now something needing medical treatment because of, again, sort of the addictive nature and so forth, we feel might have been the cause of those kinds of issues. Okay. And of course, they say to us that there is already existing in the world other mechanisms with which we can treat with sort of low level emotional issues that don't need the application of the utilization of the expertise of a clinician, which is what you get in a world where where you medicalize the issue. Okay, they say to us that counseling and therapy exist, and those are oftentimes what are most appropriate for those kinds of issues. We contend that there was a little bit of discordance in the case of Team Proposition, in as much as Team Proposition tells us at first that it just generally does not, or medicalization of the issues just generally does not employ things like counseling and so forth. And then we get to the third speaker's presentation, third proposition, a sort of an embracing rather of counseling and so forth as that which exists in the world where we medicalize. Forgive my characterization of it as over, but just medicalize the issue. All right. We also let's shift a little bit to hear how it is that opposition contends with that Team Knox College. Team Knox College creates a world where in status quo there is a growing disincentive towards persons accepting that they have mental health issues and that the issues that they exist and need medical treatment. There's stigmatization that exists writ large, and those kinds of issues create an issue where, for example, the state doesn't feel compelled because the state doesn't know the scale of mental health issues, does not feel compelled therefore to provide the resources that are necessary to treat with mental health issues. Okay, let's talk about the medicalization or over medicalization that Team Proposition contends exist. We feel that that is a truthful characterization of how it is that clinicians treat with mental health disorders. There is, objectively speaking and intuitively, I think we want to commend the second proposition speaker for proving that people, once you enter into a doctor's office, a clinician's office, you are almost automatically, once you present a concern, there's generally speaking too great a proclivity towards pulling out the prescription pad and writing a medication to treat with those issues. And that is oftentimes bad. What we're concerned about though is whether or not this exists and the scale to which it exists when we're talking about emotional disturbances, which is what the motion is contending. So we think that maybe at levels where persons are presenting with low levels, maybe schizophrenia, which are medical issues, right? By and large, there may be other ways of treating with it that doesn't necessitate the use of medication, but in status quo, the doctor draws quickly for his or her prescription pad and writes a prescription. We think that that world exists and that is true for proposition. Again, we're not sure because proposition doesn't prove to us that that question of over medicalization, not over prescription and administration of medicines exists. And if it does exist, we think it exists to some extent, but we don't know the scale to which it exists when people turn up simply with, manifestations of sadness, of grief, of loss, the kinds of human emotional experiences. Okay. So again, understand that while we give that particular contention to proposition, we think that the meaningful engagement on the issue that is presented as per the motion has not been appropriately treated with or proven. It hasn't been proven that mental health, and that emotional issues and emotional disturbances does lead to people receiving medication for said, particularly in light of opposition's characterization. Opposition points out consistently in their case that there are a multiplicity of ways in which we can, as medical practitioners, treat with people who turn up and present, a manifestation of sadness, of grief, of loss, etc. Right? That they contend that one, it is not oftentimes the case, it is not likely that a doctor will draw for the prescription and write a medication to be administered in such circumstances. Even though we think that they're a little bit uncharitable to proposition, we think that it exists, that problem exists. We don't think that it exists, and certainly proposition hasn't proven the scale to which it exists to convince us that it is something worth, shifting the debate over to their side so far. Okay. Now, if it is that there are multiple other approaches, we contend as we hear opposition contending that coming to a clinician with an emotional disturbance will lead the clinician to first of all try to find some sort of resolution, and those resolutions may be in the form of therapy, counseling, etc., which they contend exist in the world of where there is medicalization. At this point, we are challenged because we hear the very compelling argument from second proposition that tells us that, well, people, once they are operating as clinicians, as doctors, as nurses, maybe, they are by default going to draw for the prescription pad. They're going to prescribe medication. That is what they do by default. We are overall concerned that the world of team opposition, which is a world where they are forced to defend the status quo because of the formulation of the motions, and this house regrets kind of motion, we're contending that the sort of what we contend to be patching up of that world or improvements of that world were not as appropriate given the formulation of the motion as would otherwise be the case, right? So we actually contend, for example, that it was legitimate for team proposition to contend and to push for a case of education and awareness, which is what they did consistently. Again, we think that a similar mechanism, a similar opportunity does not exist in the world of team opposition. Opposition has to defend the status quo as it exists. Okay, so to that extent, we dismiss a lot of their tweaks to the status quo, which would lead to the improvements and would unlock the benefits that they contend would accrue in their world. Okay. So with that said, having passed aside, for example, I think it was called the DSF model and so forth, other mechanisms that exist, we then have to treat with whether or not this motion is pointing to, from opposition's world, a trajectory where over time they will unlock their benefits. And what are those benefits? Those benefits are one, they the provision of greater resources by the government, by the state, to treat with mental health disorders, the demystifying of mental health disorders over time. And thirdly, as well, we think importantly, persons who are on a trajectory towards suffering from mental health disorders, clinical mental health disorders, that they could be captured somehow at some earlier point and treated with so as to prevent them from getting to that state. Okay, we very much appreciate the incentive mechanisms put forward by team opposition. Team opposition contends that one, doctors, once they get a growing number of interactions with people within the population and see that there's greater sadness and greater data coming out, then they can feed that to the government and ultimately better, more convincingly convince the doctor to allocate resources towards the treatment of mental health disorders, or even those issues like sadness, grief, and loss. We contend that that mechanization was proven better on the part of team opposition, albeit we get some pushback from team opposition. Okay, the second contention that they suggest will manifest in their world is that the people at large, general population, will over time become far less caught up in stigmatizing people who have mental health disorders. And how do they suggest this will happen? They say the more people go and interact with doctors and see that, listen, doctors are people to whom they can attend and go to without necessarily being labeled and being stigmatized, because again, by virtue of the greater knowledge and awareness that they are accruing, then it sort of tears down those blockades towards help and support that exist currently in the status quo. Okay, now I think that there's an important and interesting clash shaping up here on the question of stigma. Team proposition would resolve the question of stigma through what they consider to be education and awareness, right? We contend that that mechanism is relatively weaker than opposition's mechanism. I apologize, opposition's mechanism. Also, well, if the world is so, if the society is so affected by stigma, and people aren't currently going for help and support because of the risk of being labeled and being stigmatized, then we're not sure whether or not there's going to be a meaningful or significant improvement in those circumstances when we weigh that against the outcomes that we get from team opposition. Team opposition tells us that simply people going and realizing, oh, I get some sort of diagnosis, if you will, that I'm merely sad and I need to go and get therapy, that will ultimately lead to an appropriate appreciation of lower level emotional concerns that don't even escalate towards things like schizophrenia and so forth. But more importantly as well, even schizophrenia is going to be impacted importantly and positively by virtue of the greater access and connection that people will have to these particular kinds of therapies and medical interventions. Okay. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, or rather ladies, I think you appreciate by now how difficult and how arduous it was for us as judges to sparse the arguments. I have been talking for quite a while, and I do confess that I appreciate if it is unclear to you even now, but I unfortunately have to end. And so I will make myself available should you need further explanation and insight into the call. Afterwards, after this session has ended. Okay. So again, the scores are 287 points as compared to 78 points. Okay. And so the winners of this match and the team that advances to the grand finals of the JCSA High Schools Debate Competition for 2025. Of course, we are now in 2026, is in fact on a split decision, meaning two judges voted for them. One judge remained firm in support of the team that ultimately places second in this match. The winner of this match, ladies and gentlemen, or rather ladies, is the team in opposition, Team Knox College. Congratulations to you, Knox College, on securing this hard-fought victory. Very well tried to you, Immaculate. I'm convinced that the matches that will unfold maybe at the latter part of this month into early next month will be matches that should not be missed. They will be exhilarating and excellent because of the 4 teams who will be contesting the 2 matches. So thank you again, everyone. Apologies for the long delay, the inordinate delay. I think this is a record for me as someone who chairs debates, but we had to wade through a lot to get to this outcome. Thank you very much, and all the best, everyone.
Best debater.
Right. So the best debater in this match comes to us from the winning team. We thought that that was in fact the second speaker. That's the deputy opposition leader. We think that she managed to pack in quite a lot of impactful argument in her speech, arguments that were really significant in helping us to resolve the debate. And so we want to congratulate you immensely. All right. Yeah. All right. So with that, we've come now to the end of this match, and all the best, everyone. See you sometime in maybe a few weeks from now when we gather at JCSA Park for the grand finals of this competition. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for a wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Mr. Barrett, I'm not sure if it's still.
Yes, I'm here.
The opportunity for questions is still open.
All right. I will have to stop the streaming because it's being streamed live. But I don't know how to do that. Javon, do you know how to? I think Javon left. All right. So yeah, go ahead.